Thank you. Okay, we are in Romans 9 through 11. That's our last chunk of text this morning. Good morning. We are in Romans 9 through 11, and Romans 9 through 11, just to kind of do it real fast, it's different from the rest of the book. We've changed direction. So up to this point, Paul has been talking to Jewish Christians about don't bring the law of Moses and your law requirements and your law thinking into Christianity, because that's not how it works. And the main message is humility. Make sure that you're humble and accept your Gentile brothers. And so we talked about that a good deal. Then in chapter 9, he changes directions and he's talking now to the Gentile Christians. And he's basically saying the same thing to them. Hey, just because I spanked your Jewish brothers and told them not to put this heavy burden on you, the message to the Gentiles is don't you be arrogant and think that you're special above everybody else, because that's not the message. And so we're making that case. Paul is making that case to these Gentile Christians in four main movements. The first one, I've got the first two up on the board because we're at the end of the second one. The first one is in chapter 9, verse 1 through 28. And the main point there is, this is not the main point of the section of the whole 9 through 11. It's just the main point of the first movement. And we're going to build on these movements to make one big point. So the first main point is God makes choices. God has always made choices. He chose Isaac and not Ishmael. He chose Jacob and not Esau. God makes choices. That's who he is. It's the way that he's always done it. And so in verse 24, I always try to highlight like one verse or a couple of words to help me see the one main point from this big section. And I did that with verse 24 on this one. It says, even us whom he has called, not from the Jews only, but also from the Gentiles. And so, movement number one, God makes choices. He always had made choices, and so the choice that he made is that he's bringing Gentiles into the family of God, and not all Jews will be a part of the family of God. Only a remnant of that Jewish people will be a part of the family of God. So God makes choices. Jews, some Jews, a remnant of Jews, and Gentiles are a part of the family of God. Anything on that? Okay, now that leads into movement number 2, which is chapter 9 and verse 30, down to chapter 10 and verse 13. That section comes in, I'm calling it movements because I don't know anything else to call it sections. 3 sections, 3 movements, whatever. In verse 30, it's what shall we say then? That the Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have attained it? That is a righteousness that is by faith. But that Israel who pursued a law that would lead to righteousness did not succeed in reaching that law? His question is, wait a second. God chose Gentiles and only some Jews, and he's working through this, and he says, wait a second, the Gentiles didn't even try. Like, they weren't even looking for the righteousness of God. And you're going to tell us that they get to be a part of God's family? They weren't even trying. They weren't even looking for it. You're going to say that Gentiles get to be a part of the family of God when we Jews, who have been pursuing this righteousness for all of these centuries, that we're not all going to do it? And his answer is, yeah, that's right. Why? And here's the why. Because they did not pursue it by faith, but as if it were based on works. They did it wrong. chapter 10 and verse 4 is the highlighted message of this section. For Christ is the end of the law for everyone who believes. That's the main point. And the Jewish people who didn't get across the finish line into the family of God, they didn't get there because they did it wrong. They didn't come through Jesus. This is what God has accomplished. We got one more movement to make it through this section, but that's where we are. That's what we've done in class up to this point. Do you have any comments or anything that you want to say up to this point about the text? Okay then. Would somebody read chapter 10 and verses 5 through 13? This is, remember, this is in the second section still, where Paul is saying, God has always made a choice. The second section is, the choice that God made is to come through Jesus. That's the point of this section. And so with that in mind, would you read 5 through 13?
There is no distinction between Jew and Greek. The same Lord is Lord of all, bestowing his riches on all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved.
Okay. You want to summarize that in like one sentence? The main point? It doesn't really have to be one sentence, but do you want to say what Paul is saying? Just try and make a summary of the argument here. Or how about this? If you were going to highlight one verse or one couple of words to say what is the main point of this section, what would they be? Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. That's what I do too.
Amen. It says 4 or 5 times he mentions the heart, and that's 50% of the verses we just read.
Yeah. Yeah, so we're talking about, which we'll dive into this in just a second, but we're talking in this section about you don't get right with God, excuse me, you don't get right with God by pursuing a system of works. You get right with God by faith in Jesus. And so what that heart conversation is, it's about the heart and the belief section, the faith in Jesus. That's the main thrust of the section. That's the choice that God made. That's how we're going to do this, get right with God, through Jesus. And so, yeah, the heart. Others? I do want to look at one thing with you. This is weird language. In verse 8, do not say in your heart, who will ascend to a heaven, that is to bring Christ down, or who will descend into the abyss, that is to bring Christ up from the dead. But what does it say? The word is near you in your mouth and in your heart. Let's turn over to Deuteronomy 30. I really, really like this. This section, I don't have an answer to this section. I don't know why this is the way that it is, but it's really interesting to me. When Paul makes the transition to now he's talking to primarily Gentiles, this chapter 9 and 10 especially, not so much 11, but 9 and 10 especially, it is just packed with Old Testament quotes, references to the Old Testament, which is strange to me because I would think if you're going to just pack something super dense with the Old Testament, that would have been the section where you're talking to the Jews. But he packs the Old Testament into the section where he's talking to the Gentiles. So I don't really have a comment about that other than to say, it's maybe not what I would expect, but it's interesting. So I'm in Deuteronomy chapter 30 right now. Let's see. In my Bible, 5 or 6 pages to the end of Deuteronomy. There's 34 chapters in Deuteronomy, and I'm in chapter 30 right now. Which means that we are almost to the end of the law of Moses. All of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, most of Deuteronomy. We're almost to the end of Deuteronomy. And this is what Moses, God, has to say at the very end of Deuteronomy, talking about the law. Would somebody read Deuteronomy 30, verses 11 through 14, please?
For this commandment that I command you today is not too hard for you, neither is it far off. It is not in heaven that you should say, who will ascend to heaven for us and bring it to us, that we may hear it and do it. Neither is it beyond the sea that you should say, who will go over the sea for us and bring it to us, that we may hear it and do it. But the word is very near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart, so that you can do it.
Okay. So let's do this in 2 separate stages. Number 1, what is Moses saying in these verses at the end of the law of Moses? What's his words here about the law? Yes, Andy? Yeah. So he finishes the law of Moses by saying, hey, he says in verse 11, it is not too hard for you. Neither is it far off. I mean, just think about this. I made a point about this as the end of Deuteronomy because at this point, like God has already gone through the list and said, if you're going to be a Jewish person, this is what you're going to do, and this is what you're going to not do. And then he puts this section in and he says, it's not too hard for you. And then he does this thing. He says, it's not like it's all the way up in heaven and you got to say, okay, this is a super hard law and I got to send someone up to heaven to figure it out for me. He says, no, it's not too hard for you. He says, it's not like it's all the way across the sea that you send someone across the sea that you got to figure this thing out. He says, no, that's not it. He finishes up the section in verse 14. The last words are, so that you can do it. So that's the way that the law of Moses ends. Now, what's the issue with that?
It's a choice.
What?
It's a choice. You have to choose it.
Okay, that is true. But what's the issue with the choice about choosing to do this law and Moses saying it's not too hard and it's not out of reach? What's the issue with that?
Trusting in God.
That's how you do it. I'm just talking about, you're like in the world of ideal. You got to choose to serve God. You got to put your trust in God. All those things are true and right. But practically, not in the world of ideal, practically what's the problem with that? Did any one single person throughout the history of the world except Jesus do it? I mean, that's the thing is Moses is saying here, hey, it's not too hard. It's not out of reach. And then you look at history and you got a bunch of people who are like, yeah, but nobody's ever accomplished it. It kind of seems like it is too hard. Kind of seems like it is out of reach in that way. Well, that's the law of Moses section. Now turn back over to Romans 10. And what Paul is going to do for us is, remember the first rule of all Bible study. Let the Bible interpret the Bible. And this is going to be a perfect example of that. this is one of those things where if you mark these kinds of things in your Bible, you would write next to Deuteronomy 30, you would write some kind of a reference to point you to Romans 10, so you won't forget this. Because what Paul is going to do in Romans 10 is he's going to interpret Deuteronomy 30 according to what God has always meant by this passage, which the Jewish people had no clue about. Like the Jewish people, when the law of Moses was given, had no concept of Jesus. And so they had no clue about God's intent from the very start. But Paul is going to tell us now what God's original intent was in all of this. And so in verse 6, the righteousness based on faith says, do not say in your heart, who will ascend into heaven? Well, he's going to tell us about that. That is to bring Christ down. Who will ascend into heaven? It's not like it's in heaven that it's out of reach. Why is it not in heaven that it's out of reach? Because Jesus was there and he came down to us. Who will ascend into heaven? That is to bring Christ down. Or, who will descend into the abyss? The Deuteronomy version said, who will cross the sea? Who will descend into the abyss? Well, Jesus did. Jesus descended into the sea. He went into the death. He went into the abyss. That is to bring Christ up from the dead. But what does it say? Why is it that the word is doable according to what God established? Because the word is near you, in your mouth and in your heart. That is the word of faith. It's placing your trust in the right person. That's what the law has always been about. And then Jesus is obviously the end point of that. And so I think that's a neat little thing that Paul did with that passage. Any comments that you want to say about that and how he brings it to full completion through Jesus? I think that's kind of what verse 4 is going to set up. Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. Anything you want to say about that? Do you know what is one thing? I'll just say this too in passing because I think it's another interesting thing. Do you know what Paul left off of Deuteronomy 30? Did you notice that? That Deuteronomy 30 in verse 14 ended with, so that you may do it. Paul didn't quote that part. In verse 8, he says, the word is near you in your mouth and in your heart. And he left off the so that you may do it part. Because it's not about a system of achievement through works. It's a system of putting your faith in the right person. That's how you're right with God. And so all of this then is to say, with the heart one believes and is justified. With the mouth one confesses and is saved. In verse 13, everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Number one, God has always made a choice. He chose Gentiles and a remnant of Jews. Number two, he made that choice through Jesus. Faith in Jesus, that's the system that God created. Anything you want to say about that? Christmas tired? Leftover Christmas tired? Okay. Section number 3 then. Section number 3 is going to be, I don't remember exactly what Dave's question was in the last class. I don't think you said it exactly like this, but it was something like, so then why not the Jews? I think that was the thrust, because I thought, that's the next section. So we're going to move into section number 3, which is ultimately a bigger part of this conversation in that, why, if the Jewish people have been God's chosen people throughout history, why are most Jewish people not right with God then? And the answer is going to be because God made the system by faith through Jesus, and most Jewish people have rejected that faith through Jesus. That's the answer. That's what section 3 is going to be about. So let's do that in 2 big sections. First of all, will somebody read chapter 10 and verse 14 through the end of chapter 10?
How then shall they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how shall they believe in him of whom they have not heard? And how should they hear without a preacher? And how shall they preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the gospel of peace, to bring glad tidings of good things. But they have not all obeyed the gospel, for Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed our report? So then faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. But I say, have they not heard? Yes, indeed. Their sound has gone out to all the earth, and their words to the ends of the world. But I say, did Israel not know? First Moses says, I will provoke you to jealousy by those who are not a nation. I will move you to anger by a foolish nation. But Isaiah is very bold and says, I was found by those who did not seek me. I was made manifest to those who did not ask for me. But to Israel he says, all day long I have stretched out my hands to a disobedient and contrary people.
Okay. So what's the thrust? What's the argument here?
They've heard, but they've not heard.
Okay, explain that.
They've been given the word of God, and yet they've not grasped the message. That it is something that's from the heart. It's not just rules and statutes to abide by, practices to exercise. It's love the Lord your God with your whole heart, soul, strength, and mind, not just with your hands, per se.
Yeah. I like that. I like that because I think you summarized the way that I was going to say this in like one short little sentence. They have heard. That's a major part of this conversation. They have heard, but the problem is they haven't heard. They have ears to hear, but they haven't used them. I like that a lot. That was my mark when I go back on the video to write it in my notes. I look for these things. It's like that's my bookmark, so I'll be able to find the right spot to write that in my notes for the way that it goes. All right. They've heard, but they haven't heard. Anything else before we look at it? Okay, so here's the problem. This is a question. Make sure that you appreciate this is a question because verse 14 sets up the major section. Okay, so God made a choice, and the choice that he made is through faith in Christ. This is the problem in verse 14. How will they call on him in whom they have not believed? So if God said, this is the way that you're right with me is through, Lisa, through the heart, through faith in Jesus, then how are they going to come to me and call on me if you haven't believed and put your faith in Jesus? And it's a hypothetical question. The answer is they're not. If you're not coming to me through Jesus, then you're not coming to me at all. And so in verse 16, they have not all obeyed the gospel. That's the problem. For Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed what he has heard from us? So, faith comes from hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ. This is why I like Dave's comment so much, because of verse 18. But I ask you, have they not heard? So what's the problem for these Jewish people who are not right with God? Is the problem that they haven't heard the gospel? No, he tells us the answer. Their voice has gone out into all the earth and their words to the ends of the world. They've had an opportunity to hear the gospel. The problem is not that they didn't hear it. The problem is that they didn't believe it. They didn't come to God through Jesus. They didn't put their faith in the right spot. I want to keep going with the argument, but I need to stop here real quick. Does anybody see where that quote in verse 18 comes from? This is really neat. Where does that quote come from in verse 18?
First Kings or Psalms?
Who said it?
Psalms 19:4.
Okay, Psalm 19:4. And what's special about Psalm 19? Or especially about the first part of Psalm 19? And remember the song. The law of the Lord. This is why I'm not a song leader. Chad sent out an email this morning and he said, hey, we're doing a singing tonight. Anybody who wants to sing? And I told Chad, I will do it if I have to. If there's not enough people to do the singing. Otherwise, Psalm 19, the law of the Lord and all that. What is the first part of Psalm 19 about?
The observable creation, how it declares God.
Do you remember when we talked about Psalm 19 in this class? Do you remember the context? What was that context? It was really early on in this class. Did you write it down? Who said it?
The natural law that makes even the Gentiles wild.
That's when we referred to Psalm 19 was Romans 1:18 through 32, where God said, hey, these people may not have the written law of God, but they've got this natural law that God put within their heart. And so when we were talking about that, we talked about the words natural law, the thing that all is true for all people, whether you have the written law of God or not. And we referenced Psalm 19 in that conversation because the first section of Psalm 19 is the heavens declare the glory of God. Like this is where we can know about God even if we don't have this. And that's what Paul quotes in this conversation. So what's the problem for these Jewish people? Is it that they haven't heard? And he quotes a verse out of the context that says, no, everybody has heard. Everybody's had a chance to hear. And it's not that you can know about Jesus by looking at the sky, but it's the fact that it comes from Psalm 19 that really punches you in the stomach to say, no, it's not that they haven't heard. Everybody has heard. That's not their problem. Anything you want to say about that? I would think this would be a nice spot to just insert a conversation about our world that we live in. What's the problem with so many folks in the world and why they're not right with God? Is it because they haven't had a chance to hear about Jesus? I mean, more and more that's the case. Becky's a substitute teacher. I should do like turn the mic off for this spot, but it's not like people who get upset about these things watch Bible classes on Romans from me anyway. So Becky's a substitute teacher and she comes home every single day and this is her challenge every single day. How can I work God and the Bible into my class with these kids? And she comes home and she says this every once in a while. She's reading The Lion and the Witch and the Wardrobe to a class. The Chronicles of Narnia. And she's reading the section about where the lion comes back to life and the stone table is broken. And she says, does anybody know what that's really about? Does anybody know anybody else who came back to life and all of this stuff? And she said her kids just look at her and they're like, no clue. And so, it's not like people universally know about Jesus anymore, but by and large, the problem is not that our world hasn't heard about Jesus or that they don't have access to the truth and to the Bible. By and large, the problem is that they heard it, but they haven't heard it. They haven't believed it. That's the problem with the Jewish people. They heard it, but they didn't accept it. They didn't believe it. That's the problem. Comments? All right, look at the next quote. I think this one, there's two things about this one in verse 19. Okay, so what's the problem? Did they not understand it? Is that the problem? They heard it, but they didn't believe it. Is it because they didn't understand it? Verse 19, but I asked, did Israel not understand? And the answer is kind of wonky because he says, first Moses says, I will make you jealous of those who are not a nation. With a foolish nation, I will make you angry. Well, what kind of answer is that? I think you need to know where that comes from. Where does that quote come from?
Deuteronomy 32.
Okay, let's go check that out. Deuteronomy 32. Okay, so let's do something before we get to the quote in verse 21. Would somebody please read verses 15 through 17? Because that'll give you a good sense of the context. 15 through 17 will get our minds primed for where we are in this Song of Moses. Read that for us, please.
But Jeshurun grew fat and kicked. You grew fat, stout, and sleek. Then he forsook God who made him and scoffed at the rock of his salvation. They stirred him to jealousy with strange gods. With abominations they provoked him to anger. They sacrificed to demons that were no gods, to gods they had never known, to new gods that had come recently, whom your fathers had never dreaded.
Okay, so in this Song of Moses, Moses is talking about how God saved his people Israel, but what's going to happen in the future is that Israel is eventually going to reject God. And one of the things that they're going to do is they're going to turn to other gods. That's this whole thing. They grew fat and they kicked. That you grew fat, stout, and sleek. God blessed you and gave you everything that you needed. And when you have everything that you need, I'm holding up quote marks when I say this, all of a sudden you don't need God anymore. And so what did they do? They scoffed at the rock of his salvation. Why do I need God? I've got everything that I need. Hey, dummy, you have everything you need because God gave it to you. But that's not the mindset. I've got everything that I need, so I don't need God anymore. And so this is what they did. They turned to other gods. That's our context. And verse 21 is where the quote comes from in this context. They have made me jealous with what is no God. They have provoked me to anger with their idols. So I will make them jealous with those who are no people. I will provoke them to anger with a foolish nation. Two things. Israel was God's chosen people, and God gave them everything they needed. But they rejected him, and he says specifically the thing that they did, they made me jealous with what is no God. They provoked me to anger with their idols. What did Israel specifically do that would be no God and idolatry? This is about as offensive a thing as Paul could possibly say. Did you say it? I don't know who's talking. I'm sorry. Yes, sir.
The bull that they sacrificed on Red Mountain. Or not on the mountain, but when he was getting tablets.
Yeah, so actual literal idolatry, they turned away from God. Let's get even more offensive than that. If it's possible, you think it's even possible to get more offensive than that, to turn away from God to worship other gods? What did Israel do that was even more offensive than that? That we've been talking about in the book of Romans. Yes, sir?
Sacrifice their children.
Okay, that's pretty bad, I would think. I would say, I would even push and say even worse than that. You might disagree with me. You might disagree with me and say, no, this isn't worse. But what did they try? Oh, sorry.
They tried to reach salvation on their own without the Lord,
And
by obedience to law.
They took the thing that God gave them and they worshiped and served that thing as if that's how I'm going to be right with God. Now, maybe you would disagree with me. No, it's worse to sacrifice your kids to a false god. But I would think, like, if you're God's perspective, God gives you this law as a blessing to keep you on track. It's guardrails to keep you on track. And not only that, but to lead you to Christ. God gives you this law, and you take that law and you say, I'm going to serve the thing that God gave me. It's kind of like God is just in heaven looking at these people going, no, you're doing it wrong. But Israel says, okay, this is what I'm going to do. And so Moses says in verse 21, they have made me jealous with what is no God. They have provoked me to anger with their idols. So what does God say that he's going to do? At the second half of the verse that he quotes in Romans 10. You made me jealous with no gods. So here's what I'm going to do for you. I'm going to make you jealous by choosing somebody who's no people. The Gentiles. You treated me in this way, so this is the plan for how I'm going to operate with you. I will make you jealous of those who are not a nation. With a foolish nation, I will make you angry. I think that once you have that context, you can see the argument that Paul's making here. So what's the problem with Israel? That they didn't hear? No. They heard. They didn't believe. So what's the problem? That they didn't understand? Well, kind of. They didn't understand. They did it wrong. And so because of the understanding issue, God's going to do something that nobody would have ever dreamed in a million years. And then finally in verse 20, Isaiah is so bold as to say, this is a quote from Isaiah 65. I have been found, God, I have been found by those who did not seek me. I have shown myself to those who did not ask for me. I'm bringing the Gentiles into my family, but of Israel, he says, all day long I've held out my hand to you, to a disobedient and a contrary people. Why isn't Israel saved? God says, I chose the Gentiles because I revealed myself to them for this reason. But of Israel, it's not that I've rejected Israel. I've been holding out my hand to Israel, and they've just been disobedient and contrary the whole time. So that's going to be part one of this argument. Do you have anything that you want to say about that? I'm keeping us moving because we have to finish through verse 10 today. We've only got one class left after today. Part two of the argument. Would somebody read chapter 11, verses 1 through 10?
I ask then, has God rejected his people? By no means. For I myself am an Israelite, descendant of Abraham, member of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. Do you not know that what the scripture says of Elijah? How he appeals to God against Israel? Lord, they have killed your prophets. They have demolished your altars, and I alone am left, and they seek my life. But what is God's reply to him? I've kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So too, at the present time, there is a remnant chosen by grace. But if it is by grace, it is no longer on the basis of works. Otherwise, grace would no longer be grace. What then? Israel failed to obtain what it was seeking. The elect obtained it, but the rest were hardened, as it is written. God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that would not see, and ears that would not hear, down to this very day. And David says, let their table become a snare and a trap, a stumbling block and a retribution for them. Let their eyes be darkened so that they cannot see, and bend their backs forever.
Okay, so what's God's argument there? What's his point? Did God reject the Jewish people? What's his answer to the question? Did God reject the Jews? No. What's the answer? They rejected him. Paul says, hey, I'm a Jew. It's not that God has rejected the Jewish people. Look at me. I'm one of the Jewish people in a right relationship with God. And so he quotes this Elijah passage, and the main point is in verse 5. So too at the present time there is a remnant chosen by grace. There is a group, a section of the Jewish people who can be right with God. Those are the people who come to God through Jesus. But then he quotes these last couple of passages. What then? Israel failed to obtain what it was seeking? And this is where he's going to set up the next argument that we're going to do in our last class on Wednesday. This is what God did with Moses after your golden calf reference earlier. We've already quoted that. In Exodus chapter 33, even after the golden calf incident, God said, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I'll have compassion on whom I have compassion. But with Pharaoh, God used Pharaoh to accomplish his purpose in a way that is not really endearing to Pharaoh, but still God's purpose is accomplished. That's what he says about the Jewish people. He says God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that would not see and ears that would not hear, down to this very day. If Israel is going to ultimately reject God because of their refusal to believe and to come to God through faith in Jesus, that doesn't mean they've totally messed up God's plan. God is going to use that still to accomplish his plan. Which all of this leads us into this one thing that I think is important for this class. Like, this is one of the frustrating things about these last couple of classes with 9, 10, and 11. We need to understand the flow of Paul's argument, but we haven't actually got to the point yet. So what we have now is we have a foundation about God has always made a choice. He made the choice through faith in Jesus, and the Jewish people rejected that choice. They rejected faith in Jesus, but God still used them to accomplish his plan. And on Wednesday, what we're going to do is 11 through the end of the chapter to say, okay, so what's the plan? What has all of this been leading to and talking about in the first place? And what's the practical takeaway for the Gentile audience? So anyway, that's the foundation. Do you have anything that you want to say to end this section? What last comments about it? Luke, would you hit that bell? It's 9:45. Thank you. All right. So here's what you need to do for Wednesday, for our last class. Be ready to talk in 11 through the end of the chapter. Be ready to talk about, so what was God's plan? And I would encourage you to read it slow because it's going to take some processing. What was God's plan? And what's the main takeaway for the Gentile audience? That's going to be what we do on Wednesday for our last class. Thank you very much.